On the 29th of September 2006, police in Glasgow made an horrific discovery under the floor of a local church. The mutilated body of 23-year-old student Angelika Kluk, who'd been missing for almost a week.
She was put under there, he stabbed her and he raped her. He left her dead.
The last person seen with Angelika was 60-year-old church handyman Peter Tobin, a man with a history of violent sexual abuse.
He's very reliant on this superficial charm that he's developed and that he rolls out whenever he identifies a victim. And this will essentially lead his victims to let their guard down.
The investigation into Angelika's murder would uncover a series of shocking crimes dating back as far as the early 1990s.
Tobin defies even my imagination. There is something about him that sends a shiver down my spine every time I think about it.
Peter Tobin had been unmasked as one of the world's most evil killers. It was a case that spanned 2 decades. By the time Peter Tobin was found guilty of murdering teenage hitchhiker Dinah McNicol in 2009, he'd already been in prison for 2 years. He was serving life sentences for the murders of Angelika Kluk and 15-year-old schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton. The 63-year-old serial killer and rapist had buried all 3 girls across a 15-year period, 1 in Scotland and 2 on the south coast of England.
Another awful discovery at 50 Irvine Drive. A body bag thought to contain the remains of Dinah McNicol, brought out from what was the most ordinary of houses. It is no longer.
I think what sets Tobin apart for me is the sheer relentless brutality of him. A man who genuinely paid no attention whatever to anything but his own basest instinct. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and could get away with it.
Former Detective Superintendent David Swindle from Strathclyde Police first came across Tobin after the body of Angelika Kluk was discovered at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow in 2006. The 23-year-old Polish student had been missing for 5 days.
Coming back to the church today brings it all back to me. The horrors of what must have happened here. Unbelievable. You could never imagine it. A place of worship desecrated by Peter Tobin doing what he did to Angelika Kluk.
But when they arrested Tobin, police were convinced this wasn't his first murder. David set up Operation Anagram, a task force charged with finding out more about the life and crimes of Peter Tobin.
When we looked at his life in Operation Anagram, we found that he frequented places like this: churches, religious establishment, homeless persons, hostels. How many people frequented the places that Tobin frequented? How many people did he meet that were vulnerable at that time, that had no relatives to report them missing? How many of these were missing and were never reported missing that Tobin has killed? We'll never know. Tobin knows the answer.
His story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Tobin was born in Johnstone, Scotland, 13 miles east of Glasgow, on the 27th of August, 1946.
He was part of this post-war baby boom generation. He came from quite a large family. He was one of 8 children. His dad worked for the local council and his mother was a housewife. And by all accounts, he was a bit of a wild child.
Some suggest that he was violent towards his siblings and quickly developed a habit of minor thefts and occasional burglary.
By the age of 7, he was in reform school, and that is something that is quite significant here, because these places where these boys went were quite brutal in terms of the regime, in terms of the treatment by staff. Lots of children misbehaved, lots of children went off the rails, but I think you had to be quite extreme to find yourself in a reform school.
As Tobin grew up, this childish rebellion developed into an entirely reckless disregard for the law.
Now, as a young man, Peter Tobin moved around a lot. He did a lot of low-skilled jobs and moved from place to place. And he would often get involved in property crime. He was convicted of burglary and fraud. So here's somebody who breaks the law time and time again and is seemingly okay with it. So he's crossed that boundary. He crossed that boundary a long time ago. And I think for most of his life, he's constantly pushing that further and further.
At the age of 22, Tobin began a relationship with 17-year-old Margaret Mountney. The pair were married in August 1969, by which time they had relocated from Glasgow to Brighton.
It all seemed to start rather well. He was incredibly charming, he was incredibly attentive, but it soon degenerated into something altogether different. He would regularly beat her up and lock her in the house. He was cruel towards her pets. He actually decapitated her pet puppy.
A number of the women who've had relationships with Tobin say that he can be very charming for quite a long period until you'll find that he becomes very violent. The women who've known him often talk about this ability to turn on a sixpence, to suddenly become horrific, when in fact, moments earlier, he was being perfectly nice or charming. It is part of Tobin's characteristic. He is an evil man hiding in plain sight.
He knows what women want to hear, so he will use that charm offensive in the early days, but his true colours will soon shine through. And by then, unfortunately, it's too late. He's really chipped away at these women's confidence and their self-esteem, and they're very much under his control.
The troubled relationship didn't last. After Tobin was sent to prison for 3 years for burglary, the couple divorced in 1971. After serving his sentence, Tobin wed again in 1973, but this marriage was equally as violent, and by 1976 it was over.
Peter met his third wife, Kathy Wilson, in 1986, and there was quite an age difference. She was 16 at the time, and he was around 40. So she was very young, she was very vulnerable, she was very impressionable, and he turned on the charm again, and she moved in with him very quickly, and they had a child together.
The couple were married in Brighton in 1989, and Tobin moved his young bride and their son far away from her family to Bathgate in West Lothian in 1990.
Now, this relationship went pretty much the same way as his other marriages had gone. He was incredibly controlling, he was incredibly abusive. He didn't like her leaving the home. He would make sure that she didn't go out and didn't talk to anybody. And she eventually fled. She eventually summoned up the courage to leave this relationship. And she only did that through secretly saving up bus fare for a very long time in order to travel to England with her son.
Despite their relationship ending, 45-year-old Tobin moved back to the south of England in 1991 to be close to his young son. He settled on Irvine Drive in Margate, Kent. His next-door neighbour at the time was Dave Martin.
Well, the picture he painted for the community was a nice, steady bloke, no loud parties, no loud music. He was not an annoyance in any way. If you were stuck or you had a problem, you only had to ask him and he'd give you a hand, he'd help out.
But Dave soon saw a sinister side to his friendly neighbour.
We'd be outside and a couple of young girls would walk past and he said, "Cool, how about them?" And I would say, "Don't be stupid, Pete, you're old enough to be their father." "Oh, yeah," and he'd laugh it off.
After 2 years in Margate, out of the blue, Tobin moved on again.
All of a sudden, the house next door was empty. No ifs, no buts. I shrugged my shoulders at the time. I thought, well, he's moved on. He was a little bit on the weird side anyway, so I didn't give that a lot of thought neither.
By 1993, Tobin was living in a flat at Havant on the south coast of England. His violent nature was about to turn even more sinister. On the 4th of August 1993, Tobin was at home with his 5-year-old son when two 14-year-old girls came to visit one of his neighbours.
They knocked on next door and discovered there was no one in. Tobin saw an opportunity, invited the two girls to wait in his flat with his son, after all, what could be less threatening.
As his 5-year-old son slept, Tobin drugged both girls using a chemical called amitriptyline and sexually assaulted them before leaving them for dead.
He'd subjected them to quite a violent sexual assault, and it was only when his son interrupted this assault that it finished, essentially. And Peter called his ex-wife, claiming that he was having a heart attack, and this was about 2 o'clock in the morning.
He turned the gas on in the flat and then proceeded to leave with his son, presumably hoping that they would die of asphyxiation from the gas.
But the girls regained consciousness and managed to escape before calling the police. Journalist Martin Brunt remembers hearing about the sickening attack.
2 schoolgirls, 14 years old, had been held prisoner in a flat, had been plied with drink and drugs, had been raped, and then left in the flat with the gas turned on. And whoever had done it had effectively left them to die. Very quickly, police announced that they were looking for a man called Peter Tobin.
40 days after the attack, and using the alias Peter Wilson, Tobin was found and arrested in Brighton. On May the 18th, 1994, at Winchester Crown Court, he pleaded guilty to rape and indecent assault and was sent to jail for 14 years. But he served just 10 and was released in 2004.
He changed his name so he wouldn't appear in the serious sex offenders register and wouldn't set off any alarm bells anywhere, and got a job as a church handyman back in Glasgow.
When a man called Pat McLaughlin came looking for refuge at St Patrick's Church, the priest and charity workers who took him in had no idea they were offering sanctuary to a man who would commit an act of absolute evil right under that very roof. Members of the local charity group Loaves and Fishes, Dennis and Kathy Curran, remember the night McLaughlin came looking for refuge.
I met Patrick McLaughlin in May 2006. It was a wild night, and he came in for something to eat. He said he was homeless. They had nothing to eat, and we gave him food.
This was a really, really terrible night. I've never seen anything like that in my life. We were just ready to go when he came into the door. And he came in and he said he was hungry and that, and we said, right, but Father Jerry had told him that anybody was frightened to go out into the night and nowhere to sleep, they could sleep inside the church.
Throughout his life, Tobin, who was born and brought up a Catholic, had a persistent connection with the Catholic Church, and at various points during his periods on the run or disappearing or adopting false identities, took refuge in Catholic churches and Catholic communities. I think it was simply that was somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he knew how to conduct himself, where he could hide in plain sight. He could conceal his true nature behind the facade of a church handyman or a member of a Christian community. And that was a very safe way to conceal the reality of what he wanted.
To Tobin, nothing was sacred. He took advantage of the open nature of the Currans and the community of St Patrick's.
He was with us maybe about 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And then he started giving Father Jerry a hand in the church, and he was doing bits and pieces. People don't understand, you can be with somebody a full day and they never spoke. You know what I mean? People find that hard to understand. There was nothing to sort of, it was a yes and no. That's what it was, a yes and a no.
Peter Tobin was an incredibly manipulative individual. He wasn't particularly emotionally complex himself, but he had a really good understanding of other people's emotions. He knew what other people needed to hear, and he used that to get what he wanted.
Kathy, however, had concern for the ominous stranger who joined their community.
I says to Dennis that there was something far wrong with him. I wasn't too sure what it was, but as far as I could understand, that the jigsaw with Pat McLaughlin was not fitting together. There was something not right there.
But Tobin's next step was more evil than any of them could have predicted. Angelika Kluk was a 23-year-old student from Skotzau near Krakow in Poland who was working as a cleaner in St Patrick's Church. On the 24th of September 2006, she disappeared. Dennis broke the news to his wife.
He said, that girl, Angelika Kluk, we don't know where she is. And I went, what do you mean? He said, she's vanished. All her stuff's there, all her credit cards and everything are all up in their room, but she's vanished.
Police scoured the church and grounds for evidence and began interviewing members of the community. They discovered that the last person seen with Angelika was the church handyman, a man named Pat McLaughlin. Charity worker Dennis provided police with a photograph of McLaughlin.
At 6 o'clock it went in the evening news nationwide, and within minutes their phone line was jammed to say, that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin.
Police now had their main suspect. They quickly discovered that Tobin had a violent past, and the investigation escalated at rapid speed. David Swindle was the lead detective on the case.
I became involved in the investigation when it was established that Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender, had been with Angelika Kluk. And soon after my involvement, I arranged for the church to be searched again by specialist officers and specialist teams. There's a garage attached to the church, and that is where Peter Tobin was with Angelika Kluk, working on some woodwork. He called her his little apprentice. He actually was interviewed by a police officer when the missing person report was made, and he stayed there for another day, and when the heat was on, he left. When he realised it was being treated as a major investigation, he left. This is someone that was cool and calculated.
Police launched a nationwide search for Peter Tobin.
Mr. Tobin is considered a potential risk to members of the public. Any person who sees this man is advised not to approach him.
It was a name that sounded all too familiar to crime journalist Martin Brunt.
It was a shock to find what had happened, but what made it particularly interesting for crime reporters who were covering the case was that police were appealing for a man called Peter Tobin, and it rang bells. It took me and others back to the days of 1993. They didn't realise that he was, in reality, Peter Tobin with a dreadful history of sex crimes. He was a man hiding in that community under a false name, had duped the church authorities to employ him as a handyman, and of course they were completely innocent of his background.
As the search for Angelika intensified, it became more and more likely she wouldn't be found alive.
We had another search of the church, a really thorough search, because by this time the parameters had changed. There was concern for her safety.
5 days after her disappearance, on the 29th of September 2006, police discovered the body of Angelika Kluk under the floorboards of St Patrick's Church. She'd suffered severe head injuries and multiple stab wounds after being attacked in the adjoining garage.
It was in there just after the priest, Father Jerry, left on that Sunday. Within minutes of it, someone across the road had heard a scream. He hit her over the head with a table leg. There was splinters in her head, rendered her unconscious or semi-conscious, bound her hands with cable ties, further assaulted her, dragged her in a polythene sheet into the church here and across the church, and put her body under the floor like a bag of rubbish. She was put under there. He stabbed her, whether that happened underneath there or whether it happened outside, and he raped her. He left her dead.
The British public was shocked to learn the truth of where Angelika's body had been hidden since her violent death.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
I think the discovery of Angelika's body was awful enough that a young woman had died in those circumstances, the fact that she was buried under a church added some sense of horror and drama to the way people reacted to it. The fact that a suspect was somebody who had been working at the church, somebody who seemingly had volunteered to be a handyman at the church, didn't really make sense.
DNA evidence on Angelika's body was confirmed as belonging to Peter Tobin, and his fingerprints were found on the tarpaulin he used to wrap her in.
In forensic pathology, we have what's called Locard's exchange principle. That says that when you interact with another person, you leave something of yourself on them, and you take something of them away with you. Anyone who murders another person, who physically interacts with them, they will leave trace evidence. They will leave DNA, potentially fibres, hairs, all sorts of things.
But Peter Tobin continued to elude the authorities. Despite a nationwide search, he disappeared into thin air.
So things were moving very fast. We have the human remains of a young woman who's been ferociously attacked. Horrible, horrible scene underneath the floorboards. Forensic examination is ongoing. We knew by this time that Peter Tobin had a history of violence, sexual crimes. He had been in prison. He was a dangerous person. Where was he?
David and his team wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. In early October, just over a week since Angelika's murder, they received a crucial breakthrough. Tobin had been spotted, this time using another alias, James Kelly, over 400 miles away.
We got a phone call from the police in London that he had checked into a hospital in a false name. Someone had recognised him. A Metropolitan police officer went in there and confirmed his identity. And I arranged for a team of uniform officers to bring him back to Scotland.
On the 23rd of March 2007, the trial of 60-year-old Peter Tobin began at Edinburgh High Court. He was charged with the rape and murder of 23-year-old student Angelika Kluk. Tobin pleaded not guilty and remained brazen throughout.
Went into court, he was sitting with his lawyer and he gave me a big smile, as if, "How you doing, pal, you know?" I just totally ignored it.
6 weeks later, on the 4th of May 2007, the jury took just 4 hours to deliberate and Peter Tobin was found guilty. Judge Lord Menzies described him as an evil man before sentencing him to serve a minimum of 21 years. He was immediately sent to Edinburgh prison. As he left court, he violently lashed out at photographers. But David Swindle and his team were convinced there was still more to the Tobin story. Throughout the trial, they'd been building a massive dossier on Tobin's past.
Do you get to 60 and you start killing? That was a question in my mind. Has this individual done it before? So I thought, we need to look at this individual's movements, his background, look back at his life. However, this was a difficult thing, because if it ever got out that we were looking at Peter Tobin as a potential serial killer, that would have been prejudicial to the case that we're building regarding Angelika. So I set up a very confidential operation called Operation Anagram. And that was working in a back room. And we never went over it, we never went out in the public regarding that until he was convicted of the murder of Angelika Kluk.
The police faced an almost impossible task, tracing backwards from the culprit to the victims.
It is very difficult to analyse cold cases with really only rumour to go on. If you don't have a body or bodies, if you don't know who the victims were, if they could have been missing persons or they could have been victims, it's very difficult.
There was a team of officers that had sent out to look at his connections and where he lived. And they came in excited saying, he's got an address in Bathgate. And the address in Bathgate was at the same time as a well-known missing person who'd been so many years ago, Vicky Hamilton. 15-year-old
Vicky Hamilton had been last seen on the 10th of February 1991, waiting for a bus home to Reading near Falkirk. Her case was considered to be one of Scotland's biggest missing persons inquiries.
What are the chances of an individual like that being in the same area at the same time when this really high-profile missing person had disappeared? So I contacted Lothian and Borders Police, and they started looking at the case again and reviewing that case.
In June 2007, police began to search Tobin's former home.
As soon as he was convicted for the murder of Angelika Kluk, they went overt and they searched the house at Robertson Avenue in Bathgate, and they found potential evidence it could link. It was a knife, a dagger.
But there was no evidence of a body or human remains. David Swindle and his team needed to look further afield for the answers they wanted.
Anagram was about where Tobin was, what happened in an area, what the victim, the person that disappeared, looked like. Was it his type of victim? Were they vulnerable in any way at that time? I called it investigative analysis of a serial killer.
Tobin's transient lifestyle made it very difficult for the team to work alone on the operation.
Tobin had spent his whole life travelling about, and we found this out very quickly. So we had one connection, which was Bathgate. We realised that he spent a lot of time in Brighton and Margate. I thought, we need to join this up. So Anagram became UK-wide, and it involved every single police force in the UK. And we set up this operation, which is the best example of joined-up working throughout the UK.
David's team began to uncover more potential victims.
We had another missing person that was a potential link, and that was Dinah McNicol. Dinah had been at the Lip Hook Festival, and she had been with her then boyfriend, and they were looking for a lift, and they got a lift from an individual, a Scottish individual.
But after the mysterious driver dropped off her boyfriend in Surrey, 18-year-old Dinah never made it home to Essex. She was last seen in early August 1991.
I think Peter Tobin is quite an opportunistic offender in that he will identify a victim and then he will pounce. He's like a predator. But all of the time that this is going on, he's developing his offending. He's very reliant on this superficial charm that he's developed and that he rolls out whenever he identifies a victim. So whether it's a hitchhiker that he picks up on the road, whether it's somebody who works at the same location as he does, he will deploy this charm, and this will essentially lead his victims to let their guard down.
Police focused in on one of Tobin's previous homes in Margate, 50 Irvine Drive, where he'd lived in 1991. His former neighbour, Dave Martin, remembers the day the police knocked on his door.
The police turned up in November 2007, and they asked to speak about Peter Tobin. So I told them what little I knew at the time, and then they said something rather strange, had he done any gardening? Well, it made me smile at the time because that's the last thing I've ever seen him do gardening. Then I remembered the sandpit.
Dave cast his mind back 16 years.
I noticed that Peter was digging a hole next door, so I leant over the fence and I said, "You going for Australia, Pete?" Because the hole did seem to be a bit deep. "Oh," he said, "I'm building a sandpit for my youngster when he comes up at the weekends." So anyway, I thought no more of it, and he carried on. A couple of days later, I looked over again, and the sandpit was all filled in. So next time I saw him, I said, "What happened to your sandpit, Pete?" "Oh," he said, I wasn't allowed to put one in. It was something to do with regulations. It was unsafe for the boy." So I said, "Well, I haven't heard of that one," but I thought no more of it at the time.
It was exactly what the police had been hoping to hear. Was it possible that for the last 16 years, the bodies of both Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNicol had been buried in the back garden of 50 Irvine Drive? On November the 12th, Tim Mills, the senior investigating officer on the Dinah McNicol case, made the decision to excavate the garden at Tobin's former home in Irvine Drive, Margate, convinced he would discover her body. Specialist equipment, including ground-penetrating radar, was brought in as police underwent their search.
People tend to think that these crimes are committed in very different locations. This was a very mundane, matter-of-fact, terraced house on an estate in Margate.
It took just 24 hours before the police found human remains.
I can remember to this day what I was doing when I got a telephone call from Tim Mills to say that I had found a body in the garden. I asked him, was it Dinah McNicol? And he says, no, it's Vicky Hamilton.
Operation Anagram had uncovered exactly what they'd hoped, but also dreaded to find. For Vicky's family, a 16-year wait had been brought to a devastating end in a back garden over 450 miles from where she'd last been seen.
Peter Tobin will have walked this path. It leads to what was his backyard. There are police search teams there now and several large holes they've been digging. The blue tarpaulin covers the shallow grave where they found 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton's body.
When you learn that they'd made that kind of progress, you're filled with I suppose, a sense of sadness, perhaps relief for the families, and of course it threw up the prospect of another trial of Peter Tobin.
Tobin was immediately charged with Vicky Hamilton's murder, but the police had yet to finish their excavation of his former home.
We came here to search for the remains of Dinah McNicol or any physical evidence which might link her disappearance to that house. And that's what we will continue to do.
And they wouldn't have to wait long. On the 16th of November, a second body was found in the garden, which was indeed that of 18-year-old Dinah McNicol.
The two victims that were found were essentially skeletal remains. That causes a great deal of difficulty for the pathologists. Obviously, we have no skin to look at for bruises or stab wounds. We have no organs to look at for injury or disease. But if you do have two bodies clandestinely buried in the same place, it's certainly a very big indicator that these are not two natural deaths.
When they started to bring the bodies out, I was sick because I had no idea whatsoever that anything like that had gone on. Nobody had a clue that anything like that had gone on. It was just unbelievable.
Tobin's fingerprints were found on the bin bags used to wrap Dinah's body, and post-mortem examinations found traces of the drug amitriptyline in both Dinah and Vicky Hamilton, the same drug Tobin used on the two teenage girls he'd attacked in 1993.
One of the things that's always of value in a forensic pathological investigation is toxicology. Has this person taken drugs, either deliberately or by accident? Have they been sedated by somebody else? All of this can give you answers to things that have happened with them. And particularly if you have something like a sample of liver or muscle available, then if those drugs are in the system at the time somebody died, they will still be identifiable weeks, months, potentially even years later.
Tobin first stood trial for the murder of Vicky Hamilton on the 2nd of December 2008 at the High Court in Dundee. He was found guilty. Judge Lord Emsley added another 30 years to his sentence and told Tobin he considered his crimes the most evil and horrific acts that any human being could commit. 7 months later, on the 23rd of June 2009, Tobin was in court once more, charged with the murder of 18-year-old Dinah McNicol. But it was postponed and the jury discharged on the 7th of July, as the judge, Mr. Justice Calvert-Smith, ruled Tobin was not fit to stand trial due to ill health.
Peter Tobin has a habit of feigning illness all of the time, and it's quite obvious to me why he's doing this. As a psychopath, he likes playing with people, he likes pushing their buttons, he likes to be the puppet master that's pulling the strings. And he knows that when he claims that he has chest pains or he's having a heart attack, that prison authorities need to react to that, they need to respond. And I think he quite enjoys watching people running around after him and pandering to him. I think he finds it quite entertaining.
On the 14th of December, Tobin's trial for Dinah's murder resumed at Chelmsford Crown Court. William Clegg QC was prosecuting.
Well, all murder cases are traumatic for obvious reasons, but this one particularly so because the family had absolutely no idea what had happened to their child for nearly 20 years. So there was a great deal of emotional tension in court. The family were there throughout the trial and behaved with great dignity and composure throughout it.
During the trial, even more revelations came out about Tobin's callous nature.
She had been left some money by her mother, who had died prematurely, and there was some £2,000 of it in her account at the time of her death. After her murder, Tobin had withdrawn that money from a number of banks on the south coast, banks that were situated comparatively near to addresses that he had a connection with, and therefore there was yet a further connection.
Dave Martin took to the stand to testify against his former neighbour.
He was sticking his thumbs up and saying, "Are you okay, Dave? I haven't seen you a long time." Which was a little on the shocking side to me because I really didn't want to know him. It was as if he wasn't taking any of the proceedings seriously.
The defence offered no arguments against the evidence, and the trial lasted a mere 3 days. The jury deliberated for a brief 15 minutes before returning their decision. Tobin was guilty, yet again.
Well, to be honest, it was a very easy case to state. The evidence against him was overwhelming. One had to use just an element of common sense to appreciate what would be the chances of a stranger burying a body that they had presumably murdered in a random garden, selecting one that just happened to be one that another murderer had already buried somebody else.
On the 16th of December 2009, Judge Mr. Justice Calvert-Smith handed Tobin another life sentence, his third in total, with a recommendation that life means life. In July 2010, it was reported that officers working on Operation Anagram had narrowed their review down to 9 unsolved cases of murder and disappearance. Despite claiming to have killed more women, Tobin has so far refused to cooperate with the police.
Peter Tobin has no respect, a man of no humanity. He will talk. He's been interviewed by police officers involved in Anagram, but he'll talk about himself because this is an individual that loves himself. He doesn't care about anyone else. So he gets a gratification, whatever gratification he has had, killing people. He's a sad, sad individual who's taken probably more lives than we know.
What sets Tobin apart also for me is that he's taken some pride in gloating in the wake of his imprisonment that he's killed 48 women and then saying, but you've got to prove it. No proof of those extra killings has ever been brought forward, but a number of high-ranking officers, particularly in Scotland, are absolutely convinced that Tobin has killed many more women, but they don't know which ones and they don't know where.
In June 2011, the failure to identify more victims led to Operation Anagram being wound down.
I am proud of what I did as regards Peter Tobin in forming Operation Anagram, Search for the Truth. I left the police in 2011, but I'll never forget that. I'll never forget the Tobin case. And in my mind, I always live in hope that we will find out the truth someday. That's why it's important that we have programmes like this. People like Tobin and other killers should never be forgotten about.
I think Peter Tobin definitely killed more people than he's been convicted of killing. Somebody like him doesn't just stop offending for any lengthy period of time. I think there are victims that we don't know about. I think he was incredibly careful with some of the people that he targeted.
Peter Tobin's crimes spread far and wide across the UK and left a lasting effect on the people he met.
Tobin is an evil man. He's got no respect, no compassion. Peter Tobin, the only thing he's worried about is Peter Tobin.
People say, you want him to die? I said, I don't want him to die. I want him to live a long time and every day be filled with fear, real fear. That's what I want for him. Because what he done to people is horrendous.
I think Peter Tobin is evil. Always was and always will be. And that's my honest opinion of it. And I think he's done more than people realise.
The sense that he knows something that the rest of us don't gives succour to Tobin's vast arrogance. But to be honest and to be clear, there is a level of depravity in him which I fear knows very, very few boundaries. He's genuinely terrifying man, and I hope that he spends the rest of his life firmly behind bars.
Peter Tobin is evil. He's horrible. 34 years in the police, I have never dealt with such an evil individual.
Tobin's insatiable need to cause pain and suffering knows no bounds. He's proved to be toxic to anyone he's met or any community he's entered. He is a dangerous sexual predator who callously ended the life of at least 3 young women. We may never know if there are more victims of Peter Tobin, but we can be sure that his lifelong incarceration means there will certainly be no more.